Good morning. Wow, applause for an entrance again. Whew. My name's Anita Gaffney, and I'm the festival's executive director. And I have a fun fact for you. Today is July 13th, and it's the 67th anniversary of the Stratford Festival. Yeah. So as you go about your day today, you can reflect on the evolution of that festival since 1953 and all the things that it's brought to us and all the impact it's had on the world and all the discussions that it's generated and will be generating going forward. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the Indigenous people who stewarded this land. We'd like to thank the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe for their stewardship of this land that they share with us through the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Treaty. This week we have been very fortunate to have the New York Times with us, and this is a continuation of that collaboration, and we're delighted to be talking today about Arthur Miller's play The Crucible through the lens of the Me Too movement. Today's event is being live streamed, so I'd like to welcome our virtual audiences from around the world. We're so very pleased to share our conversation with you today. We'll begin with introductions of the moderated discussion and of course leave time for questions. The ushers will hand out cards and pencils and then collect them in an orderly fashion, and we'll ask those questions. And for our live stream audience, please feel free to pose questions on the conversation feed, and we'll do our best to include them in our questions today. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you our moderator, New York Times culture reporter, Cara Buckley.
Hi there. Thanks to everyone for coming today and people who are tuning in. I am Cara Buckley. I'm a reporter with the New York Times. I'm a culture reporter, and I've also written about Me Too, and I write about the intersection of gender, politics, and representation in Hollywood. And before we jump in, I'm going to introduce this amazing panel that we have with us today to talk about The Crucible and Me Too. We have Shannon Taylor, who plays Elizabeth Proctor in this Stratford's production of The Crucible, which begins previews on August 1st. Shannon's in her 5th season here at Stratford. She's played Olivia in Twelfth Night, Viola in Shakespeare in Love. She's played Margot Frank in The Diary of Anne Frank. There's a bunch of other things here, but you get the idea. She's the real deal, obviously. We have Dana Seitler. Seitler is a professor of English and director of the Bonham Center for Sexual Diversity Studies at the University of Toronto. She is the author of Atavistic Tendencies, The Culture of Science in American Modernity, and Reading Sideways, The Queer Politics of Art in Modern American Fiction. Her current project, Broken Life, Withdrawal, Biopolitics, Ecstasy, focuses on the politics and aesthetics of renunciation and pleasure in American literature and culture. This is Dana. And to my left, my immediate left, we have Dr. Leanne Carlson, the Henry R. Luce Initiative on Religion in International Affairs postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Religion and Media at New York University. She received her PhD in philosophy of religion from Columbia University in 2015. From 2015 to 2018, she worked at the Stewart Postdoctoral Research Associate. She worked as their Stewart Postdoctoral Research Associate at Princeton University. Her book, Contingency and the Limits of History, How Touch Shapes Meaning and Experience, is forthcoming from Columbia University Press this year. She is currently working on a new book on the refusal to forgive. Leanne. So first, I'm going to speak a little bit. I'm going to recap The Crucible, the storylines, jump into why Arthur Miller wrote the play, and then talk a little bit about the intersection of The Crucible and Me Too, or why we're here today. And then we're going to jump into the panel. So my spiel will be a couple of minutes, but I think it's a good refresher. So the play, of course, was written by Arthur Miller in the early 50s, and it's about the witch trials that occurred in the 1690s in the Puritan colony of Salem, Massachusetts. The hero of the play is John Proctor. He has had an affair with his young servant, Abigail Williams. Abigail is cast out by John's wife, Elizabeth Proctor. A group of girls, led by Abigail, are discovered dancing in the woods, after which a few girls fall into a sort of coma. witchcraft is suspected. So at the time, at 1690s, it's coming to the end of a huge purge throughout Europe of the many witch trials. And so this is happening in Salem at the tail end of that. As a way of saving herself, Abigail ends up leading a young group of girls into accusing dozens of townspeople of witchcraft. Elizabeth and John Proctor are both accused. After they are imprisoned, John Proctor and Elizabeth are allowed to see each other before his execution, at which point, I'm really summarizing this obviously into a few pithy paragraphs here, but at which point Elizabeth blames herself for John's affair with Abigail, saying it's a cold woman whose husband has to resort to lechery. John Proctor at first signs a confession, admitting to have consorted with the devil, but then rips it up. As he is being led off to be hanged, Elizabeth says he has his goodness now. So Arthur Miller, when he wrote The Crucible, said he wrote it as an act of desperation, and that much of his desperation stemmed from a couple of things. One of them was Depression-era anxieties. His family lost everything in the Depression, and also at the same time, he was trying to process the rise of European fascism and the anti-Semitism that fueled it. And so in the early 50s, of course, the House Committee of Un-American Activities was convened by Senator Joseph McCarthy in the States, and was resulting in the blacklisting of lots of artists, writers, producers, etc. And Miller's own plays were being affected. There were boycotts of Death of a Salesman. It was deemed anti-capitalist. A few years earlier, another group called for all of Miller's plays to cease production in occupied Europe. He knew of 2 actors who had committed suicide as a result of the McCarthy investigations. People were fleeing in self-exile to Europe. And right as he was beginning, actually driving to Salem to investigate the true witchcraft trials, his close friend, the gifted director Elia Kazan, told Miller he was going to name names in front of McCarthy's committee. So Miller headed off to Salem to research the witch trials, and he poured through the court documents, and he saw clear parallels between the witch trials and McCarthyism, and I'm just going to read what he wrote about it, or what he said about it. He said, "The more I read into the Salem panic, the more it touched off corresponding images of common experiences in the 50s. The old friend of a blacklisted person crossing the street to avoid being seen talking to him, the overnight conversions of a former leftist into born-again patriots, and so on. Apparently, certain processes are universal. When Gentiles in Hitler's Germany, for example, saw their Jewish neighbors being trucked off, or farmers in the Soviet Ukraine saw the kulaks vanishing before their eyes, the common reaction, even among those unsympathetic to Nazism or communism, was quite naturally to turn away in fear of being identified with the condemned. As I learned from non-Jewish refugees, however, there was often a despairing pity mixed with, well, they must have done something. Few of us can easily surrender our belief that society must somehow make sense. The thought that the state has lost its mind and is punishing so many innocent people is intolerable, and so the evidence has to be internally denied." And he wrote that in the mid-90s as the production of the Daniel Day-Lewis movie, who was soon to become Arthur Miller's son-in-law, was happening. And so as he's going through the court records, he comes across a crucial moment. It describes the real Abigail Williams, who was 11 years old at the time, and another girl reaching to strike Elizabeth Proctor in the actual trials. But instead of hitting Elizabeth, Abigail at the last minute slows her fist down and touches Elizabeth Proctor lightly, and then cried out that her fingers burned. And Miller said that reading that, the play was born. And so the real Abigail Williams was 11 at the time. John Proctor was 60, and historians said it was quite likely the two had never met. But Miller, in that moment, he read as a moment of conflicted tenderness, and this is where he sort of went into a flight of fancy. He said Elizabeth Proctor had been the orphaned Abigail's mistress, and they had lived together in the same small house until Elizabeth fired the girl. By this time, I was sure John Proctor had bedded Abigail, who had to be dismissed, most likely to appease Elizabeth. There was bad blood between the two women now. So, and that Abigail started, in effect, to condemn Elizabeth to death with her touch, then stopped her hand, and went through with it, was quite suddenly the human center of all this turmoil. So he made the play in a way about young women's, about sexual jealousy. There was no record of that in the historical record. He also had a lot going on in his own personal life, and he talked about this too. His first marriage was coming apart, and he believed he was a bit to blame. He was also falling in love with Marilyn Monroe. And he said that John Proctor the sinner might overturn his paralyzing personal guilt and become the most forthright voice against the madness around him was a reassurance to me, and I suppose an inspiration. It demonstrated that a clear moral outcry could still spring even from an ambiguously unblemished soul. So that's a little background on Arthur Miller writing The Crucible. So what does all of this have to, there's a lot of this has to do with Me Too, but we might not be here today if it wasn't for another vaunted figure in culture, which is Woody Allen. So in 2017, after Harvey Weinstein, women began stepping forward accusing the American producer Harvey Weinstein of sexual misconduct. Woody Allen said in an interview, "You don't want it to lead to a witch hunt atmosphere, a Salem atmosphere, where every guy in the office who winks at a woman is suddenly having to call a lawyer to defend himself. That's not right either." So all of a sudden, and what in that moment, Woody Allen walked those comments back a bit, but it's sort of the cat was out of the bag because a lot of men, and I heard in my coverage of Me Too, a lot of people felt like this has gone too far and there's a hysteria gripping the women. Are they to be believed? And one of the things when we were prepping for the panel that came out was, in Me Too, the stories are real. I mean, in the play, the hysteria of the young women was not real. Although in the real Salem, as it turned out, this is crazy. And this is in the Smithsonian site. There's a chance they ate a type of rye bread that had a fungal element to it, and they could have been tripping on an LSD-like thing. So there's a lot going on. And so anyway, we're going to talk about all of that today. And, people did liken and have likened, and still to this day, liken what is going on with Me Too to a bit of hysteria. And a friend of mine at the New York Times was talking to a Hollywood producer, and they were talking about Me Too. And my friend, who's a man, said to the producer, who was granted anonymity, "Well, what do you think of the movement Time's Up that is advocating for Hollywood women?" And this producer, who thought, "Oh, I'm talking to another guy," he said, "Yap, yap, go back to your kennels." And when he saw my friend's face fall, he's like, "Oh, I shouldn't speak that way." But there's this idea still in Hollywood that, and arguably in a broader culture, that Me Too has gone too far. And one of the things we're going to talk about is whether, definitely unwittingly, Arthur Miller set this template out of what is a witch hunt. And certainly, the President of the United States has also used that term recently as well. So with that, I'm going to kick it to the panelists. And I'm going to start with Leanne here. I'm just going to start. She wrote this wonderful essay on Me Too and The Crucible. And she calls The Crucible breathtakingly misogynistic. She builds up to that. This is
not out the gate.
It isn't her first line. But she says it reduces the whole tragic mess to the calculating sexual jealousy of a teenage girl who was happy to watch her neighbors hang if it meant she might one day resume her adulterous affair with her former employer. It's fatal attraction with buckled hats. And so, yeah, I would love, for each of the panelists, starting with you, Leanne, talk about, is it fair to look at something like The Crucible through the lens of Me Too?
Yeah, thank you. And I'm glad that my fatal attraction and buckled hats line actually got to make it to some people, because I was a little smugly proud of that. Look, so I think Arthur Miller did two pretty remarkable things when he wrote The Crucible. One is that he created really vividly this portrait of anxiety and sort of public justice run amok, where it seems like there's not a way to free yourself, to clear yourself of these accusations, that the only way to escape being hanged, ironically, is to capitulate. And that is an anxiety, particularly when you're talking in American culture, because we are prone as a nation to these sorts of moments like the satanic panic, if you think of it, of things getting out of control, accusations being made, people's lives being kind of trampled on and not necessarily being able to rectify that. And so he creates this really vivid template for talking about it. And at the same time, he manages to do it by taking witch trials, which have historically persecuted women, outsider, marginalized people. I mean, even in Salem, if you think about it, most of the victims overwhelmingly were women, not men. So he takes witch trials and he turns them into a story about powerful men being persecuted. And there's a real willful perversity, I think. I mean, maybe unwillful, but perversity nonetheless, in making that gesture of turning witch trials into, getting fired for trying to rape people in your office. And so I do a little bit think that Arthur Miller made that switch possible. So that's to start. Do you want to jump in? Either of you ladies?
Go ahead. I think it's important to keep in mind, and this is a wonderful, you laid that out really wonderfully for us, so thank you. We're dealing with three distinct histories, and we do need to keep that in mind, even though we're talking about them together, right? So you do have the Salem witch trials of 1692 to 93. You have the moment in which the play is written and produced in 1953 in the context of the context of the era of McCarthyism and anti-communist hysteria. And then you have Me Too. And so in some ways, each of these are distinct moments. And in part, I would say, we don't necessarily need Me Too to think about the gender politics of these other two historical moments. So what Me Too does needs to be understood both specifically in how it's actually being treated now, the way in which these past histories make certain metaphors available to characterize women as either hysterical or unbelievable, right? So those things matter. But that it's not that Me Too necessarily tells us something we wouldn't know otherwise about the Crucible, right? What's inherent within the text itself, what the text reveals to us, are the ways it's entrenched in its own politics of gender and sexuality within its own historical moment, right? And so Me Too is making a conversation public that people like me that come from a field of feminist studies have been talking about for a very long time. Like I could think about the Crucible in this context without Me Too. So it's interesting also to see how Me Too then allows for us both to see the Crucible in new ways or enable a new kind of conversation, but also make certain kinds of scenes from the Crucible, as we were talking about earlier, a little bit more cringy.
Right, right. So Shannon, you're in the middle of rehearsals for the Crucible as Elizabeth Proctor. Can you talk a little bit about your reactions and how it feels to be doing that play? Because you haven't seen the movie, you hadn't seen the production, you just dove into the script. And how was that for you as playing this character?
Yeah, thanks, Cara. I am right in the middle of it, so we are currently rehearsing, and our first performance will be August 1st, so we are still very much exploring and identifying some of this, and I myself, as Shannon, is also trying to make sense of some of this. In reading the play, I certainly had a pretty evocative reaction to it, but I was not prepared for my reaction to step into the play as an actor, to go to those places and to try to give justice to Elizabeth, but also to step into the time of that, the power imbalances of that period, has been very challenging and a great challenge and very rewarding. Thankfully, I'm in a really trusting rehearsal room where everyone telling the story is on side and we're working together, so I feel safe in the room. So that absolutely helps moving forward. But in speaking with some of these extraordinary women in preparation for this, I was reminded of my modern sensibilities when I would like have physical reactions to hearing them speak about some of the things I was feeling as a modern woman in that room, but I didn't necessarily know how to give voice to them, because my role is to step into Elizabeth. That is to serve her story of that time. So this has been very fascinating for me because I come at it from such a different point of view. But it is very challenging, and I was encouraged to share that because I think some people think as an actor that's our job, and it is, absolutely. But I'm Shannon in 2019 who is having to try to revert my mentality to a time period that is not... that is a very helpless time for certainly for Elizabeth. She is a victim. She doesn't have a lot of power, and the cost of that is something that I'm stepping into repeatedly every single day, and it isn't easy. So I thought I would share that as well, that as actors up here, in order to best tell this story in a convincing manner, it does have its cost on the actor, because I share some of these feelings, whether I can articulate them as eloquently as these women. I was saying earlier, in my bones, I feel as a modern woman, a revolt against it, or a desire for equality or more power, but that doesn't particularly exist in 1692 in Salem, Massachusetts.
Yeah, I was going to jump into that because I had also rewatched The Crucible after Me Too happened, and I have to preface this by saying, despite calling it breathtakingly misogynistic, I loved that play growing up. Oh my God, I would come home every week at the end of sports practice and just throw myself on the couch and just reread it constantly.
What did you love about it?
Oh my God, like the heroic redemption narrative at the end of like this poor sort of tortured human, and just the sort of meagerness of goodness, and yet it nevertheless being enough, right? That moment of he have his goodness now, God forbid I take it from him. Like, despite quite a lot of critical consciousness that's happened in the intervening years, I still tear up when I see that. But one of the things that I actually hadn't noticed is the sheer amount of physical violence against the younger women,
right.
Not against Elizabeth Proctor, against Abigail Williams, against Mary Warren. And if you
Who
rewatch,
was a servant to
right,
John
sorry.
Proctor.
And so if you rewatch the play or the movie, what was actually very interesting to me is the reason that John Proctor ends up in prison is not because of anything Abigail Williams does. It's because his servant, Mary Warren, who he's been basically abusing throughout the play, like he hits her, he shakes her, he yells at her. He's finally gotten her to confess that they're making it up. And at first she does, and then it becomes clear that she is going to be pinned as a witch if she keeps trying to unveil what the other girls are doing. And so she just doesn't have the loyalty to this man who's been like abusing her throughout this entire play. And she folds and she points at him and says something like, you would know this better than I do, Shannon, but he stops my breath at night, which is just such an amazing evocative way of describing that sort of anxiety and powerlessness.
And there's also a dynamic in the play. Do you want to jump in, Dana?
No, go ahead.
Between the younger women and the older women, Elizabeth, that you said you had trouble with. Oh, sorry, Shannon.
What's your...
Good. Even now, you embody her. That was another part of the struggle, right? I mean, that was another thing in the play, right? I mean, it's the younger women versus the older women, like the women were at each other's throats.
Yeah, that's not an easy dynamic to step into. That's the other thing about when I initially heard the comparison between Me Too. My initial response was, as Cara spoke to a little bit earlier, that the women are telling the truth in Me Too, and the danger of the comparison, actually, because these women are, the younger women in The Crucible are deceitful and manipulative in how they come forward. Now, The reasons for doing that, we don't know. Also, how they started was calling out some older women, saying that they were accusing them of witchcraft, and the response they got from the powerful men of that time was revolutionary for them, I can imagine. All of a sudden, these judges, once it became a trial, were taking these younger women out for drinks at the pubs, and they had a voice in a time where they never had a voice before. So did these younger women initially seek out to call out the amount of people that they did that were hanged in the end? I don't know, likely not. Their response was, or they were reacting to the response from the people of power during that time. But it is a very challenging thing for the younger women to be calling out the older women, and I have so many curiosities around that, why that was the case. We can look into that. We don't exactly know. It's been discussed perhaps that the older generation of women have allowed this Puritan society to kind of suppress the women of that time, and so it was a revolt against that. I don't know if that is true, but that certainly is a very curious dynamic, the women against younger women against the older women.
And I think we can think about that as a kind of struggle over what femininity is ultimately going to be allowed to be within a particular society, right? I mean, it's really interesting if we think about the history itself. So this particular moment, in the 1690s, was a moment in which there was incredible anxiety about the consolidation of society. Like, what kind of society are we going to have, right? How do we actually remain true to God, even as we form a political community? Because this is a Bible-based society, right? And so there's a lot of anxiety that brings with it the desire to sort of to discipline the body. And when you're disciplining the body, that always also ends up meaning that you're disciplining issues like gender and sexuality. So what was going to be the appropriate way to be feminine? What is the appropriate way to have a female sexuality, right? Mm-hmm. And so if you then fold into that question, and so this is a very disciplinary sort of time where these things are being worked out not only via the Salem witch trials and accusations of witchcraft, but in all other kinds of ways as well, in which behavior within the household, within the civic polity is all being codified. And so when you fold into that, this sort of generational question, right? With older women upholding a particular set of sort of codes for being a proper female, and then younger girls, right, wanting to. I mean, again, you can't totally read into the sort of the history here, but right in the play itself, it's represented as the misogynist, sort of version. It's like a cat fight. So here's Arthur Miller saying that he wants to represent national hysteria, but he chooses female hysteria in order to do it, right? And these women sort of fighting with each other. But if you think about questions of sexual agency and the way in which sexual agency and even sort of gendered agency to be the kind of woman you want is stripped from women constantly at different historical moments, then you can look at the play and the historical moment and ask, well, what counts as agency in these moments? Does accusing the women that are actually in control of the disciplining of your body, does accusing them count as a form of agency, right? Does actually entertaining the possibility of cavorting with the devil count as a kind of possibility? Because actually within the particular moment in the 1690s, we have to remember that this is a society that actually believes in the devil. The devil exists, and there is evidence that some people were practicing a kind of what would be called witchcraft, right? And so to actually go into the forest and dance naked, as these women do, at least in the play, and there's historical evidence of in the time, is also a form of sexual agency, right? That needs to be policed. In order for this Bible-based society to exist, to thrive, right? So this kind of discipline of the society all happens via the policing of female sexuality, right? And so that contest between women, I think, has quite a lot to do with that.
Do you think it's fair? Like, Arthur Miller was writing at a time, it's like pre-second wave feminism, pre-Betty Friedan. I mean, is it fair on poor Arthur for us to sit here today?
Right.
But I know
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like to
Oh,
look at
it's
the
totally fair. He wrote he wrote a public drama, right?
Right.
And so the thing that Arthur Miller did was make this conversation available.
Right.
So it's not about accusing Arthur Miller as an individual who did some misogynist things in a play. I mean, he wrote a brilliant play, and he was a brilliant playwright. What it is thinking about how this counts as a particular form of historical evidence of the way in which people understood gender and sexuality to function, and the anxieties over gender and sexuality and how it functioned in the world. Right.
Right. Which arguably,
And Arthur Miller's a part of that.
right, and then sort of gave us a blueprint to work with that's still in use today. Right? Would you say?
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, just to jump onto the question of whether we're being too mean to Arthur. I do actually. One of the things that is interesting is that there is more going on in the play than maybe he intended on that front, right? Like I had mentioned the sort of class division and the labor disputes that were going on and the way that John Proctor was beating his servants. Like that's a quite interesting detail to be putting in there, right? That sort of sensitivity to what it's like to be a disempowered woman and a young girl in this society without a lot of clout. I think it's too interesting to be just like a straightforward cat fight, which would be the reading. Shannon?
Yeah, this kind of came up when we were speaking earlier that I guess there's two parts of this conversation, perhaps what you're speaking to too. One is that what we're speaking to here isn't necessarily what Arthur Miller intended. So
Right.
the play in and of itself, when you said, Leanne, that you respond emotionally to. I also to John Proctor at the end. It is a beautifully moving story, and the actor Tim Campbell, who plays John Proctor, is a vulnerable, compassionate man in real life, and so to see him go to those places, you can't help being in the room but be affected by that, and certainly the audience hopefully will as well. So that is one part of the conversation, the play in and of itself. But having it programmed in 2019, you can't help but, and I think we have a responsibility as artists to be aware of our modern sensibility in returning to this time frame. And my hope as an actor is that if we can tell this story as truthful as we can, as with commitment and honesty to the story that was written. The hope is that, as you said, it gives a platform for conversations such as this when the audience is come and see the show. So that's what gives me hope, I guess, that this conversation will continue well beyond the hero's journey, which inevitably is something that most people are drawn to, that the heroic, that absolutely exists, but there is room for a conversation beyond that as well. And so I hope you guys all come see the show and encourage this conversation further, through your own interest, because that's the way that I think we can provoke change and also help enlighten one another on different points of view.
Yeah, though, as you were saying that, I'm going to play devil's advocate now, which feels like a loaded metaphor given the context.
Where's the tribunal?
No puppets. Yeah, but one of the other things you had mentioned, the way that this play provides a template for thinking about the present and Me Too. One of the things I find actually sort of troubling about it is the way in which it is reducing this broad, complicated social movement that Dana had so nicely summed up into interpersonal conflict. And that's also something that I have like a little bit of worries about with Me Too, that it took off as a movement because so many women identified with these sorts of experiences in the workplace. And yet the way the conversation has played out has often centered on overwhelmingly questions of apologies, right? Like, did Louis C.K. do a good apology? Did,
The answer is no.
Right, but these sorts of questions where these figures who just sort of like haphazardly, contingently end up in the limelight and become representative of this broad trauma that lots of women experience, then somehow symbolically get to resolve or not resolve these issues. And I find that troubling and a way of in some sense, dodging the true mass implications of Me Too. And that, I think, The Crucible
Yeah,
is.
I mean, it's interesting because we had talked about this when we were chatting on the phone. So it's an interesting thought experiment, I think. Like, what if we thought of Abigail as the hero of the play? She's not. This is a strategic misreading. She is the villain of the play. She is the lying, conniving femme fatale who, woman scorned, right? Who's going to get her revenge.
fatale.
And the play, in this sense, does traffic in these kinds of gendered stereotypes that demonstrates a lot of anxiety about femininity and proper codes for femininity, where you have Elizabeth as the good wife, who nonetheless, who isn't sexual enough, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a cold woman who drives a husband to lechery.
It needs a cold wife to prompt lechery.
There we go, much better. Right? And Abigail herself calls Elizabeth cold several times. And so
Sniveling.
And then Elizabeth confirms that, yes, I wasn't sexual enough. Abigail is too sexual, right? And she talks about the heat, so there's Elizabeth's coldness, and she's always going on about the heat between her and John, and she says, John, you're not a wintry man, and these kinds of things. And so these are these kinds of gendered stereotypes that the play itself is trafficking in many ways reproducing, and also doesn't get talked about very much. But then there's the figure of Tituba, who is Paris's slave, who in fact is the person that brings them out to the forest to dance naked and sort of bequest favors from the devil. Although it's Abigail apparently that is the person that begs her to do it. And so we also really want to think about racialized female sexuality and how that's represented through Tituba as well, and the way in which certain kinds of cultural practices, because she says, I'm not trucking with the devil, but I do, I come from Barbados, and this is okay in Barbados, to actually have these spells and perform these rituals. And so the way in which particular kinds of cultural practices become unrecognized by settler colonial violence, settler colonial ideology rather, and how those get policed as well. So it's all sort of wrapped together, in that. So, but if we have the thought experiment of Abigail being the hero, then things do shift in the sense of, is she in fact using what she has to express a sexuality that isn't allowed to come, into being? And while that's a strategic misreading and not the intention of the play at all, it does actually sort of illuminate some of the things that you were saying, like what happens if we don't believe the play and understood it via other kinds of ways that women can occupy their gender, perform their gender, right? Have a relationship to their gender and their sexuality.
Another thing we were talking about in conversations building up to this panel today was how John Proctor, his reputation is so important to him, and this has been one of the defining features of Me Too in terms of pushback against it. Is and questions that still linger of how do these men come back, and with their reputations blemished, and what if innocents are swept up into the Me Too movement and wrongly accused. And recently I did a profile of the actress Emma Thompson, and I asked her that question, and it's kind of a cheap question, how do these men come back? No one really has the answer. And she just said, she said, to the play Othello, and I think it was Cassius, I'm going to mess it up, but my reputation, Iago, my reputation, and how much the fear of loss of reputation becomes the primary focus of Me Too in certain people's eyes, as opposed to the centuries of, subordination and worse that women have faced. And she said, if I hear one more thing about men's effing reputations, and I know it's hard in a patriarchal society, but I'm sure they will figure it out.
I am so jealous that you got to meet Emma Thompson.
She was everything you would hope for.
She was wearing a lime green suit. No, she corrected you on the color.
I said, she was wearing this outfit, and I thought it was like a palate cleanser. Like her, I was like ginning up metaphors in my head, like, oh, it's lime sorbet, like a palate cleanser, like you. And she says, it's pistachio.
Sorry.
But this is a big driver. I mean, that fear is a big driver, and I think often eclipses some of the legitimacy of, what is happening with Me Too, like the concerns, of, how will these men come back, instead of how many women have they affected. So I worked on the Louis C.K. story, and I, interviewed women who had been at the receiving end of his sexual misconduct. They have not come back. Their careers have been really hurt by them speaking out. And that, to me, is very interesting and very telling and very troubling. And to me, this is a clear parallel between The Crucible and Me Too, the real concern with reputation. I would love your guys' thoughts on that.
I do have to say, I read a couple of years ago, Stacy Schiff, who's done a fair number of popular biographies, did one called The Witches on the Salem trials. And actually the most interesting part of the book for me was the chapter she had on what happens after the trial ends, right? Which is the thing you don't normally think about in terms of Salem. But at some point, everyone has to realize that this whole thing got out of hand. We probably murdered way more people than we needed to. And it's still, and it's not to put it too flippantly, but it's still like a pretty small community. And so how do these people all come back and live next to each other? And the answer is there was nonetheless for a number of them a remaining stigma attached to having been accused, even though everyone sort of saw that it had gotten out of hand. And there was a lot of property that was taken from people, and eventually there were reparations paid, I believe, to the various families of people who had been killed. But it's just sort of like stayed uncomfortably in the community.
Right. Some of those properties, I think, for 100 years after, people wouldn't buy. Once people had been accused of witchcraft, their properties had been left. Some of them were claimed by other residents, but many people refused to live until 100 years later. I think to actually, because that it did still live. If you believed in that as sincerely as they did, to kind of let go of that, I think became very challenging.
Yeah, so it seems like the real Salem didn't have any better thoughts than we do on.
I mean, it's also really, the focus is interesting, right? Because it takes the focus off of how these women, as survivors of sexual violence and sexual harassment, negotiate the rest of their lives, and the trauma of the event of that violence and harassment. That it shifts to, what will the future of these men be now? And so I have a critique of that, but no, I don't know that I have, that kind of response. The interesting thing about the play too is that it really is taken up with, like, John Proctor is very concerned with his reputation. And one of the reasons why he doesn't want to confess to witchcraft, because his name is so important. And there's a line about that.
Yeah, I meant to bring the play, but it's the kind of one of the heroic monologues, because it is my name. So once he does decide to confess, it's in the privacy of a prison cell, and then when he realizes that it has to be made public, both verbally, that it will be passed on, that John Proctor, he's one of the people who have confessed, as well as they need it written down, they need his signature. That really, really complicates the decision. I can't speak, I'm not playing that part, but certainly written in the play, it does speak to the complication around that. And the value of his name, of his reputation, is one of his fundamental arguments. So to be able to confess, and he inevitably admits that he's lying, but the reality of that being shown to the rest of the residents. He talks about his children, how we have 3 sons and another child on the way, how that will, the ramifications of that onto his family name. So that is one of his main arguments.
And so his heroic act in a number of ways is because he refuses, because he also is then asked to name the names of the other witches. And so then he's going to be condemning them as well. And so he ultimately refuses to do so, and instead, is the one that goes to the gallows, right? And so he sacrifices, his ultimate act of redemption is to sacrifice his name, his good name, and his reputation. And then that becomes the focus, and not necessarily like, these other kinds of issues that have been going on around gender politics. And what's interesting about that is, again, the way it shifts the focus to the way the play wants to be about the ultimate redemption of masculinity, right? Because John Proctor, this all starts because John Proctor has an affair on his wife with his servant, with Abigail. And throughout the course of the play, that's just taken as a kind of common happening. Like, this happened, he's kind of, racked by guilt about it, but really Abigail is the one that in fact is carrying on this torch. He's ready to go on. And so that actually gets completely exonerated by this like wonderful heroic act of redemption by his ruining his reputation, as if it wasn't already ruined by the betrayal, right, by the act of adultery.
Yeah.
And the betrayal of his wife.
And
so
Elizabeth is the one. I mean, he certainly takes responsibility and definitely has guilt. But Elizabeth, in the end, her final her final moment before she speaks to the goodness of John Proctor is, as you mentioned previously, taking responsibility for that, which is complicates the story.
And to riff on the thing of names, part of the debate about Me Too is, in some sense, renaming what women have gone through, right? Like,
Right.
in that it's, if we're all talking about the casting couch, well, that's fine. But then when someone's like, actually, the casting couch is coerced sex,
Right.
and that's when everyone's like, whoa, whoa, whoa. That's,
And
Yeah.
it's so interesting too, there was a real tipping point. When the Harvey Weinstein story came out, a bunch of people in Hollywood were sort of shrugging, like they always knew there was weird things about Harvey. There was always, no, really, I mean, what was interesting, I had covered him written about him for a couple of years. He'd been in the same orbit, and he was a ferocious bully. And that was almost a cover. You just didn't want to get near him because he would come at you. Physically, verbally. I hope I'm not libeling myself here. But anyway, this was just a known thing about him. And it was a cover, I think, for a lot of what he was doing. People just didn't want to, it was hard to get out. There were rumors. And even when the first stories came out, I would have conversations with men in Hollywood, and they would say, "What? The casting couch, it's as old as the hills," as if like, what's the big deal? And again, using the casting couch. And it was amazing that it became a tipping point. And things that had come before forced this. The Bill O'Reilly, the revelations of, women accusing Bill O'Reilly, the Fox News anchor, of sexual abuse. What was happening in America with Trump. All of this became a groundswell, and
here
then
in
finally
Canada
with
with
Harvey,
Gianco
it
Mesci.
tipped, and it burst to the fore, and people realized we're on the new ground. We can't call it the casting couch. Like, what does that really mean? It means harassment. It means coerced sex. It means rape. It's not cool. The Cosby stuff.
Right.
How many women had to step forward and say, we were raped by Bill Cosby before anyone? I mean, it was just there. They were saying it for years. And so I think we're still grappling with what does it look like now, because it is a patriarchal society. It's still men often running the show. And so in absence of the power, people are looking around, well, what do we do now? And I think that the play is true to that too, in a way. Like, that sort of bewilderment of what do we do without, our hero, in a way.
Yeah. But also it means, like, what if, again, strategic misreading, what if we believe the women in the play, right? We come to, they're lying because the play says they're lying, right? But what if we don't? And I was thinking about what you started out by saying, Leanne, which is that, what if the thing that they're sort of rebelling against is the fact that they're being beaten, by John Proctor as in Mary's case, as their servants. What if it's because Abigail, as an orphan, is sort of at the mercy of these families for her livelihood? What if it's all these other kinds of things that's both leading them to want to have a little bit of a naked dance in the forest, as well as these accusations of the elders that are disciplining their bodies. In that case, then they're not lying, right? But there's such a readily available metaphor here. I'm thinking about Jian Gomeshi here in Canada to sort of bring that, to our home place. He was acquitted because the women were not believed. Even then, so you're saying how many women had to come forward? Same thing with Jian Gomeshi. So many women came forward, and he was acquitted anyway. So one of the things that also happens within these trials, rape trials, trials of sexual harassment, sexual violence, is that the women are not believed, that they're thought, they're sort of characterized as being in some kind of collective hysteria. Many of the women in the Jian Gomeshi case were actually characterized as spurned girlfriends, jealous that he didn't want to stay with them, and they're enacting their revenge in the courtroom. So many of the things that we actually sort of are characterizing Abigail as, right? And so again, if you flip the script and you say, well, what if, there's something actually there?
And even then, it doesn't, like with the Louis C.K. women, they were believed because he said he did them, but people were like, but it wasn't that big of a deal what he did, like really, like what? And the women who spoke up against it, that's what they faced from their own community, from the comedy community, because they were aspiring comedians, many of them. So he did that. What's the big deal? Like, why is this a problem? And so they were believed, and still it didn't. It was a really rough fallout of them on them. Right. Okay. So, and let's talk about the term witch hunt still. Should we just throw it out now? Like, should we just not, should we, retire that term? Not that.
Yes. Part of the problem, I think, with the term witch hunt is that it carries the conclusion in the metaphor, right? If you're calling something a witch hunt, it has all of these connotations of, hysteria, this thing's not real, that you can't really believe the people making these accusations. And as I mentioned a little bit at the beginning, I'm actually fairly sympathetic to a desire to have a conversation about what public reckoning looks like and how you put safeguards on that to make sure that innocent people aren't in fact swept up. But calling Me Too a witch hunt is not a conversation. It's the end of a conversation on that front.
And it's interesting because, again, it degenders the term, even though it's being used as a misogynist term, but it's being refunctioned to now mean hysterical women, which is what Arthur Miller does to it in the play, when the actual history in Salem is, in fact, women were the brunt of the witch hunt, right?
Yeah.
So, but that's not, like when Trump says it, when Woody Allen says it, that's not what he means. He doesn't mean stop persecuting women because you're afraid of their sexuality,
Probably not, no.
Right.
I also think that it dehistoricizes witch hunts, which you had talked about, but one of the
Can
other...
you dehistoricize
witch hunts?
Yeah.
Insofar as... Okay, so for Salem, for example, there's been quite a lot of scholarship in the last couple of decades that focuses on the role of anxiety that everyone in Salem was feeling because they're on a frontier, they're having all these wars with Native Americans. I believe in actual historical record, a number of the girls who made the accusations had family members who were killed in the raid. And I think, as you mentioned...
Abigail, speaks to that in the play.
Yeah.
Her parents.
So there's that context of like the anxiety, the fear, the sense of a very vulnerable society that gets completely lost when we're talking about Robert Mueller as a witch hunt, because the assumption there, right, is that you're doing it out of spite. The witch hunt is being done deliberately, knowingly, as a type of vendetta, basically, and that it's not a product of other anxieties. Whereas, I actually don't think most people in the historical record, like most historians, think that it's anything nearly as straightforward as people, a room full of girls deliberately lying to take down the society. I think they just think it's sort of like a murky situation where people genuinely, you do have in the historical record these examples of people getting caught up in these, we call it nowadays conversion disorder, but it's what we used to call hysteria, but just having all these physical symptoms that just ping pong off of each other and no one's deliberately doing it and nobody can stop.
Or they're tripping on LSD.
Or they're
Right,
having,
as we learned.
fungal rye bread.
Yeah.
Shannon, I would love, so how do you then occupy Elizabeth in a way that feels truthful while navigating your impulse, those modern impulses? You know, just, are you at all in rebellion with the character, or how would, you know, I know you're not.
It's a great question, and I'm also still very much learning how to do that, because we are still exploring and in rehearsal. I did spend the first couple weeks angry at the play once I was in the room, and not necessarily sure why, but I did have an instinctive reaction to it as Shannon, to Arthur Miller's, just what was on the page. And so I've spent time trying to understand my instinctual reaction to that, and some of that does still exist, and I think it was now, as we have this conversation, but even before so, it was my immediate reaction to some of these things that we're speaking to. But as an actor, I do feel it is my job, and I'm choosing to tell this story. Any actor has the opportunity to say no to the show. So I willingly, consensually agreed to tell this story. I do believe there's value in it. For the reason that I spoke to, that hopefully it provokes further conversation, and I think it is quite complex and is not black or white. But it is very hard to try to realistically and honestly embody a line. It needs a cold wife to prompt lechery, and the risk of that is what if that is misunderstood? What if some of the audience goes around accepting that as the reason all of this has happened? Elizabeth is only in reaction to her circumstances, and even at the end, he has his goodness now. That's kind of one of the main themes that the audience is left with. I feel as the actor consumed by the complexities of the story, and it's not just as simple as John Proctor finding his truth and his goodness, and his reputation being soiled. So it's complex is the answer to that. And something I'm still navigating, but one of the things that does help is having a room of people who all have a modern sensibility and are all equally trying to understand this as a company, and conversations around that. So it's not, I'm not trying to do it on my own. So that does help, and the value, I hope, is that people consider some of these conversations as well as with their own lenses, how complex the story is. But it does, as I started one of my first comments, it does have a cost, and I think sometimes that can be underestimated, people viewing it, because I am playing a character. It's not Shannon playing the character, but the only way I know how to play a character is through my own life experiences, through literally breathing in breath to this woman. So the greatest value I can try to give is to try to understand Elizabeth in those circumstances. And when she says she kept a cold house, there is truth to that. How we look at that now, it certainly it's harder to receive that. But she had 3 children. I think she was what we think now dealing with, a physical illness or postpartum, thank you. So she has her own navigation through that too. It's not just black and white. I'm not saying she is not at all responsible, but the complexities around that can be challenging to try to find how to embody that. So I'm still working on it, but to give value to the story, it is I take it on to try to be truthful to the time, as well as mixing it with Shannon's sensibilities.
So I, as a nosy non-actor, when we had been talking earlier in preparation for this panel, you had mentioned that some of the younger girls without speaking parts were also somewhat uncomfortable with their positions. And so I'm wondering, first, if you could just say a little more about that for the audience. But I'm also just wondering how much of this is explicitly discussed, right? How much of your anxieties, your modern sensibilities, comes out when you're rehearsing for the play, and how much of it is just like, I don't know, whatever magic you guys do, thinking about character motivation or
Yeah, I think both exist. So part of our job is to certainly tell the story in a truthful way and speak Arthur Miller's words, but we also are, as I mentioned before, in a room that is trusting where any of these things can be voiced as a company, either individually with our director or together. So some of those things have come up. And to speak to the what I was saying earlier, some of the younger women in the company, the way the play is structured is that the majority of when you're talking about lines, the voices in the room, the voices in the play are the male characters. That's as written. And so as a result, it can sometimes be that the space is predominantly male-driven based on the way that it's written. So that's something I think we work as a company to try and find equality in the room, which we have, so we can all share the story together as an ensemble. And some of those things our director leads us through, like game-based bonding exercise. I don't think you would call it that, but that also really helps to have us all come together as a team so that we know the boundaries and the parameters. And that doesn't always happen right away. That's something we come to in any room, any rehearsal room. People have worked together before. There's maybe more trust that happens right away versus where it takes time for our entire room to come together. So that's something I think that any rehearsal room, including this that you're working on, is the further we get into it, the more that we come to tell the story. And then that allows us to go to the dangerous places in the play. So if you have a safe rehearsal room, then we're more willing, which is where we're going now, to the dark, very aggressive, challenging places, because you know that you're in a trusted room.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think. Thank you so much for sharing all that. It's really fascinating, actually, for me too, to just hear about that process. And I think it's really important to say that even as I'm sitting here sort of critiquing the play, because I'm really interested in how it's, how it's negotiating these kinds of issues of gender and sexuality. I don't want to censor the play. I don't want to not see the play. I think everybody should come back and see the play. And I'm going to drive down and see what I know is going to be an amazing performance. So I think what's interesting to me is what the play makes available, like conversations like this one, right? And that's why I always like to play the game of, what if I don't identify with who the character that the author seems to want me to identify? Sometimes Elizabeth, always John Proctor to a certain extent. What if I suspend that, sort of request, to direct my attention in one way and focalize elsewhere? What if I understand? What if I identify with Abigail, and what can I learn from identifying with Abigail? What if I identify with Mary? What do I learn from identifying with the position of Mary, right? And the play does make that available regardless, right, of Arthur Miller's intentions, right? Or even the historical context of McCarthyism for the play. It's still available now for us to think about in relationship to politics now, right? And issues that affect all of us now.
Yeah. I'm going to read a couple of audience questions, and some of them are similar, so I might synthesize them. But this is one that's kind of interesting. I thought, well, they all are interesting. If the term witch hunt has become a shorthand way of dismissing, reducing something as hysterical and untrue, is there a similar rhetorical way or analogy to refute that characterization?
So is the question, do we have a metaphor that allows us to talk about like the mass group dynamic that's not already just assuming that it's all lying? Is that the question?
I think so. I think that could be interpreted to be the.
Okay.
We could call it a dialogue. We could call it a conversation. I mean, I don't know. I'm wondering, do we need a counter metaphor? Or do we need to sort of reveal the metaphor and how it's functioning? It would be a different way to put that.
Yeah. I mean, I think the problem for me is that it's got a sort of diagnosis built in about what sort of group dynamic is going on, right?
Yeah.
Because one way of looking at Me Too is that that the initial outlet of certain stories allowed women, and not just women, to reevaluate things that they had previously taken for granted, like all sorts of events that you had, just sort of shrugged off as the price you pay for walking through the workplace, and the sort of reevaluation and understanding that's part of a broader social problem. And so, like, is that a hysteria in that sort of way? Is that the sort of like feeding of emotion? How do you disentangle the kind of pernicious sense of losing all sense of perspective and being swept away with emotion from the sort of reassurance and feeling that you're part of a broader mass movement and suddenly there's solidarity where you didn't believe there was? And so I think it's a real question as to whether or not, I think it just assumes too much about what's going on and what the feelings are that are driving it to use witch hunt.
And also, I think that that the automatic, so the term that goes along with the witch hunt is something like, sort of mob mentality, right? And so the idea is that if you ever have a group of people together, and maybe especially if they're a minoritized group, there's this automatic anxiety that in fact there's a swept away sort of feeling there. And instead we could think about collectivity, right, as a counter term. Like, what does it mean for mass movements to form? What does it mean for collectives to come together and empower each other? And then it's not these deeply individualized moments, because something like the way that the term witch hunt was being used in the context that you raised was very individualized, right? It's because the women wanted to get back at Harvey, or that sort of thing, instead of it being a collective movement in which a necessary conversation needs to take place, right?
And the irony there is that, the women still often felt very individual. They didn't feel like they were part of a thing. They felt like they were putting their necks on the line by stepping forward, and they were. And a lot of women haven't and won't, and a lot of women see how the other women who step forward, who aren't in positions of power, like it's one thing for Gwyneth Paltrow to step forward to say, this was an inappropriate thing happened to me. She has so much power. It's another thing for a woman who has no power to step forward and to sort of deal with the repercussions of that. So they often, even though they might be seen from the outside looking in as a movement, as a, for them, it's just them. The little, women I interviewed who they didn't want to step forward. They said, well, what will I be bringing into my life? What will be the first thing if you Google my name that comes up? I don't want that future. And it's not just minimizing, it's just a complete mischaracterization, because they still are paying for something that wasn't their fault, over and over again. So this question is, I like this one. Okay, I like them all. Given everything we are talking about today in terms of Me Too and the sexual liberation of women, do you think it's necessary to still do this play? Shannon.
I mean, I can't really answer that. I think every artist who chooses to participate in telling that story is saying yes. Because as I said, we as individual artists, we do absolutely have a say. It is our choice which stories we are choosing to tell. So I believe it's worthy. I signed on board because I do. I certainly couldn't say absolutely no, we should never do this play again. That comes up with it's not the first time a question like that has been asked at a classical festival. There are some archaic or can be considered archaic plays now that are very, very challenging to watch as a modern audience. But I think if we just cancel them all out and not perform them, then there's danger in that too, because it takes away from the conversation. So I do believe there is value in telling the story, but I'm still learning the costs of that kind of on a daily basis, and yet I still believe the value of it. So it's a really complicated thing. I don't know how to answer that. I'm sure there are people who believe that no, it shouldn't be done. Like Taming of the Shrew is another play that comes up. I remember one British director here speaking, saying he believes all Shakespeare plays should be performed, but he would never direct Taming of the Shrew. And I was so curious around that, but I guess the difference is if you're lending your voice to it, and the cost of that, or each individual is responsible for that decision. But it's hard. I just will reiterate, I hope it provokes dialogue, and it's already provoked dialogue in my own life that helps solidify my own beliefs, my values, the stories I'm interested in telling, and why, and if it's harder to come to a play, why is that? It helps me understand my own perspective. So for me, that's valuable, and it's do you say crunchy, or somebody said, I think it can be crunchy and hard, but sometimes that's how art provokes. So I really do believe the conversations around it are of great value, and I again, I've said this before, but I encourage all of you to continue that, because that's more conversation begets further conversation, and for me that's of extreme value.
I mean, I would also say that if you do find it persuasive, what we've been running with, which is the idea that the Crucible in some way provides a template about how we still talk about these things, then it's infinitely better for that to be happening in this sort of context where you can have an actual conversation, where you can actually discuss some of the historical realities, the ways in which Arthur Miller decided to make this a story of female sexuality, as Dana has been saying, as opposed to a story about LSD or a story about, frontier anxieties or anti-Catholicism in certain ways. And so it's, I think it's much better to have that in a sensitive context than it is to just sort of let it be out unexamined in the world.
This question, might the fact that Miller was falling in love with Marilyn Monroe, a highly sexualized woman, be part of the reason that female sexuality is such an important factor in the Crucible?
Who did that one? So
I think so too.
I just think it's really interesting too that shortly after The Crucible is written and performed, and he gets involved with Marilyn Monroe, is that he writes the screenplay for The Misfits, which is this Hollywood movie starring Marilyn Monroe, which is all about her sexuality.
Right.
And it's a kind of critique of her sexuality on display, even as it reproduces her sexualization. So whoever wrote that question, like, if you haven't seen The Misfits, I really recommend it.
Right. If Miller had written the play post Me Too, how should it differ?
I would be extremely impressed if Arthur Miller was still around.
That's one of those imagine that questions.
Yeah.
I'd be interested for a female playwright to write post Me Too. I'm also performing in Mother's Daughter in about 2 hours here, if you want to come see it, 2 p.m.
Can you? And for people who aren't familiar, just if you could give a synopsis of what the play is.
Mary Tudor has come to the throne. Edward, her younger brother, has died, and it's kind of her journey towards the actions that we have now characterized her as Bloody Mary, and she's also been very, very villainized and or forgotten or mixed up with Mary Stuart most of the time. So Kate Hennig is an extraordinary woman and playwright and actress and artist, and it's really, really fascinating to be able to tell that story. And I can tell, and I've heard many audience members say this, that it is written by a woman, the play, and she really tries to humanize what is another Mary Tudor, who has otherwise, as I said, been villainized, by saying things like a line like, "No one else who has ever," and I'm going to forget my line that I'm about to say. Like no one else who has ever ran a country was responsible for the death of their enemies. Of her time period, it was a very, very, very gruesome time period. But for some reason, the first Queen of England, she represents villainy, and Henry VIII predominantly is a hero.
Hell of a guy.
Pardon?
Hell of a guy.
Yeah, nobody knows who no one knows who Mary Tudor is, and then you say, oh, she was Henry VIII's daughter. Oh, Henry's daughter. And all of a sudden that gives value or voice to her. So to answer that question, having a female playwright humanize, and we don't know the truth of who Mary Tudor was, and my version of Mary Tudor, that's not really the point, is it just adds another layer of conversation to have it written by a woman 400 years later, and also have her humanized into a very, very complex human being, I hope, in how it's written, versus how we've looked at her through history and through male history predominantly.
I mean, and again, I'm not sure that we need Me Too to imagine that rewrite, but yeah, I think that, again, as was being pointed out, the affair between Abigail and John Proctor was completely fabricated. So that was a choice on behalf of the playwright to actually turn this into a play about a woman scorned. If a post-Me Too Crucible, if by that the person who wrote the question means, how would we actually have a play about the Salem witch trials now, then we might actually, and I don't think it needs to be necessarily a woman that writes it, but maybe if it was written by sort of a feminist, queer, anti-racist perspective, then it would take into account it would take into account the kind of historical, political, and cultural and religious context that we've all been talking about that informed that moment. And so we'd have to think quite a lot about settler colonialism. We'd have to think a lot about the various wars between indigenous communities and the usurpation of land. That actually really does contextualize why the trials themselves happened, right? As a kind of deep anxiety over how are we going to actually form a society at this moment, right? And the kinds of politics that informed that.
Yeah. I mean, I would also be interested, when we were talking earlier, Shannon had mentioned, maybe it was actually in our conversation right now, that being Elizabeth Proctor is sort of a dark place to be because her life starts out terrible and just keeps getting worse. And she's watching this whole society circle the drain, I believe you said. And wouldn't it be great to see a rewrite of The Crucible that's just from Elizabeth Proctor's point of view?
Well, that is the next question I was going to ask. While Miller chose to focus on the trial of a man for witchcraft, we know that historically more women were accused than men. Do you think the implications of The Crucible for Me Too and for gender politics would have been different if the central accused person had been a woman, such as if Elizabeth had been accused instead of her husband? Would that have, changed the play? I mean, of course.
Elizabeth is accused in the play, but by Abigail.
The central character. Like if the central character had been Elizabeth, which would be more historically, representational, right? Because I think in Salem, was it 19 people were hanged and 15 were women, I believe?
I don't remember the
I
exact
think it
number.
was like 15
definitely predominantly women.
Something like that.
Right. Right.
And it's not fully verifiable.
Right, it's not fully verifiable, but it speaks to the point, of what you were saying, right? Of if Elizabeth had been the central.
Yeah, and I think it actually would have also been interesting to watch more explicitly in focus her sorts of struggles with the adultery. Like even if you kept the plot exactly the same, because it's not just the women who have been assaulted who are in some ways the victims of Me Too. It's also the people who are married to the men who have been accused, right? Like in these various situations, what do you do when your husband has been accused in Me Too, right? Or something along those lines. And I think that's also just like a really interesting position to inhabit because you do have such human loyalty to someone like that. and then yet there we are with that social moment.
I mean, that question's very much akin to the thought experiment. I was saying, like, what if Abigail was the hero? So what if, sort of Elizabeth is, and what is she going through? And it makes me think of, different kinds of feminist revisions of something like The Wizard of Oz, right? People have seen Wicked, and so,
Right.
which is, what if we actually saw this from the perspective of the Wicked Witch of the East? Is it the West or the East? Anyway, right? And then it's
West.
like West. Yeah, thank you. I mean, the Witch of the East is her sister, and she dies.
She's good. Oh, no, she's
and it's
good.
totally different, So
Yeah.
it's that kind of.
One thing I'll add to that is also there is a bond between Elizabeth and John that I think is written into the play, and certainly the actor playing John Proctor Tim and myself are trying to inhabit, that they do have a very deep connection within their marriage, the two of them, and they are both in some ways revolutionary of that time. They both speak as the play goes on to not believing in witches. They don't have their final son baptized. John Proctor, for various reasons, has not been going to church. I've also not been going to church. So they definitely do align in some of their belief systems, and of course, it's of a time where they are not necessarily or not equal in their marriage, but she's not total. Elizabeth does have a voice within her marriage, and there are scenes that are written within the play. That the difference is when Elizabeth is then speaking within society, how she must kind of behave around the parameters. But there is some freedom within the privacy of our own home, and the conversations around there. So I do believe. And I am fighting for that as well as Tim to find a very real connection between them and their marriage, and a love and a respect and a trust, so that it doesn't totally negate. Of course there were issues too, but I think there is value in that relationship, and that I do hope the audiences receive that their trust and love for one another.
Mm-hmm. I think we've run out of time. There was other really good questions that I just wanted to really quickly address. One was, how do you feel about Me Too swinging too far to accusations without proof? That's a whole other conversation. I will just say that, Ryan Seacrest was accused. He's a TV host. He was accused. He went through an internal investigation, and he's back in his job. I think that the focus should remain on the women, and I know that it's a big conversation, and we just have to tuck that in there because we've run out of time. So there we go.
Great.
Sorry?
Thanks.
Thank you.
That was wonderful. Is this on? Yes. I want to thank Cara, Shannon, Leanne, Dana for your wonderful discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you all for
having
coming.
us.
We really appreciate it.
Thank you all for coming.
I really like the idea of the thought experiment, so I'm definitely going to go to the show and put myself into a character that I might not have been manipulated into following. And something that I was reflecting on.
My work here is done.
Sorry?
I said my work here is done.
Yes, your work here is done. Yes, yeah. Something I was reflecting on during the discussion was, what if social media was around at the time of the Crucible, and what power that would have given the women in the play, and it would have put a different frame on it. So let's do that discussion next. The New York Times continue to be with us. Cara returns tomorrow to be part of a panel about politicizing theater coverage. She'll be joined by Jesse Green, who's the co-chief theater critic at the New York Times, and by Scott Heller, who's the editor of the theater section. So please return, same time, same place, tomorrow morning. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, ladies.